Remember when action heroes were untouchable gods with biceps the size of tree trunks? Sylvester Stallone and Arnold Schwarzenegger were blowing up entire tropical jungles without breaking a single sweat or messing up their perfectly styled hair. And then came 1988, a bruised, terrified, chain-smoking New York cop named John McClane crawled through a claustrophobic air duct and completely destroyed the Hollywood formula. Die Hard is universally praised today as the absolute greatest action movie of the 1980s. But behind the camera, this cinematic masterpiece was an absolute train wreck. What you are about to hear is not a heartwarming story of visionary genius or careful, meticulous planning. It is a terrifying story of blind panic, studio desperation, and a series of catastrophic accidents that somehow glued themselves together into movie magic. Today, Reel Behind is taking you back to the bloody, shattered glass corridors of Nakatomi Plaza. We are counting down 15 chaotic truths about the making of Die Hard. And I promise you, by the time we reach number 1, you will never look at Hans Gruber's terrified face the same way again. Because that look of pure, unadulterated horror falling from the skyscraper, that was not acting. But we will get to that ultimate betrayal later. Before we jump blindly into the elevator shaft, make sure you hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss another trip back through cinema history with Reel Behind. Now, let us start at the bottom floor of this beautiful, stressful disaster. Number 15, the corporate cheapskates. Behind the camera, this iconic hostage situation started with a problem that had absolutely nothing to do with German terrorists. It had entirely to do with greedy Hollywood accountants. When 20th Century Fox finally greenlit Die Hard, they were already nervously sweating over the ballooning budget. Building a massive, multi-level skyscraper set from scratch on a soundstage would have cost millions of dollars that they simply did not want to spend. So, some frugal studio executive looked out the window of their sunny Los Angeles office and saw the perfect, incredibly cheap solution. The studio was actually in the middle of constructing their own, brand new corporate headquarters, a massive high-rise right there in Century City. Instead of renting a proper soundstage or securing a remote location, the studio bosses forced the production crew to shoot inside the unfinished Fox Plaza building. They essentially turned their own active corporate construction site into a chaotic movie set. Imagine being a normal construction worker laying down drywall and installing pipes during the day. And then at night, a frantic film crew rushes in with blank ammunition, heavy cameras, and buckets of fake blood. The exposed steel pipes, the raw concrete floors, the hanging electrical wires you see in the movie were not the result of brilliant production design. They were literally just the unfinished, hazardous floors of the actual Fox building. The corporate executives were practically charging themselves rent to blow up their own future offices. Because apparently, the only thing scarier than a hostile takeover by a band of international thieves is the monthly budget report from a Hollywood studio. But while the studio was saving a fortune on the building architecture, they were about to create a massive physical problem for their leading man. Which brings us to a detail most fans completely missed, proving that movie magic is sometimes incredibly awkward. Number 14, the rubber hobbit feet. There is one tiny specific detail in the script that defines John McClane more than his iconic gun or his dirty police badge. He spends almost the entire movie running around a glass-covered, bullet-riddled war zone, completely barefoot. It is a brilliant narrative trick to make the hero feel completely vulnerable and human. You can practically feel the agonizing pain with every single step he takes on that cold, unforgiving office floor. But if that sounds incredibly dangerous for an A-list actor, it is because it absolutely was. The production team had to spread thousands of pieces of shattered candy glass across the floors for the explosive shootout sequences. Even though it was technically fake glass made from sugar, running aggressively on it for 14 hours a day would have shredded Bruce Willis's feet into raw hamburger meat. So, the desperate special effects department had to come up with a bizarre solution. They crafted custom-made, slip-on rubber shoes designed to look exactly like Bruce Willis's bare feet. If you pause and look closely during certain wide shots, or when McClane is sprinting away from the terrorists, his feet look completely unnatural. They look giant, swollen, and cartoonish, almost like he stole a pair of oversized feet from a hobbit in the Shire. Bruce Willis had to sprint through deadly explosions wearing what basically amounted to giant, terrifying clown shoes painted with human skin color. The director of photography actually had to constantly change his camera angles and use extreme tight close-ups just to hide the absurdly long rubber toes from the audience. It was the kind of ridiculous behind-the-scenes reality that completely shatters the illusion of the tough guy action hero. But dealing with giant rubber feet was absolutely nothing compared to the blind panic happening over in the writer's trailer. Because apparently, Hollywood looked at that problem and thought, yes, let us make it worse. Number 13. The script with no ending. Fans often assume that a flawless masterpiece like Die Hard was meticulously planned out from the very first page. The truth was much stranger and infinitely more stressful. When director John McClane yelled action on the very first day of shooting, nobody on the entire set actually knew how the movie was going to end. They had a solid beginning, they had a messy middle, and they had a whole lot of terrifyingly blank pages. The script was constantly being rewritten, torn apart, and desperately stitched back together while the cameras were literally rolling on the floor above them. Writers Jeb Stewart and Stephen E. D'Souza were locked in a cramped trailer on the Fox lot, furiously typing out new dialogue and massive action sequences. They would print the pages while the ink was still wet and physically run them over to the confused actors waiting on the dusty set. The pressure was completely suffocating. They had a multi-million-dollar production burning money by the hour, and the writers were making up the central story as they went along. The iconic, cathartic scene at the very end, where the villain's monstrous henchman Carl suddenly rises from the dead and is finally shot by Sergeant Powell, was not in the original plan. They literally figured out the emotional climax of the movie while they were halfway through shooting the middle of it. The legendary escape using the ambulance hidden in the parking garage was a frantic last-minute addition because they realized they needed a dramatic final getaway vehicle. In Hollywood, a simple solution often means making things dramatically more complicated for everyone desperately trying to keep their jobs. They were basically flying a massive commercial airplane while still trying to bolt the engines onto the sides. And when you are moving that incredibly fast, in a state of constant, sleep-deprived chaos, people are bound to make mistakes. And I am not talking about fake Hollywood mistakes. I am talking about the kind of terrifying, real-life accidents that make you realize how lucky they were that nobody actually died. Number 12, the accidental fall. Remember the incredibly tense sequence where John McClane drops down a dark, claustrophobic ventilation shaft? He barely manages to catch himself on the metallic edge of the lower vent, dangling helplessly over a massive dark abyss. That heart-stopping slip you see on screen was not choreographed by a brilliant stunt coordinator. It was a genuine, terrifying mistake that nearly resulted in a catastrophic injury. The stuntman performing the drop was supposed to grab the first vent immediately, but his hands slipped completely off the cold metal. He plunged further down the shaft in absolute, uncontrolled freefall, scrambling desperately to grab anything he could before hitting the bottom. The sheer panic in his flailing arms and the violent jerk of his body when he finally caught a lower ledge were 100% real. Director John McClane was watching from the monitors and realized that the genuine terror of a man fighting for his life looked far better than a perfectly executed stunt. So, they kept the horrific mistake in the final cut. Because nothing says smart planning like fixing a problem by simply surviving a near-fatal accident. But while the stuntmen were risking their physical lives, the leading man was taking a massive risk with his Hollywood reputation. Number 11, the walkie-talkie tears. In 1988, action stars did not cry. They gritted their teeth, they flexed their massive, oily biceps, and they spouted cool one-liners while blowing up enemy compounds. But late in the production schedule, Bruce Willis was sitting on a dirty bathroom floor, pulling fake glass out of his rubber feet. He was talking over the radio to Sergeant Al Powell, realizing he might actually die in this building. And suddenly, without any warning to the director or the crew, Willis started to break down and cry. He let out a trembling, emotional confession about how he had treated his wife, letting real tears stream down his dirty, blood-smeared face. None of that emotional vulnerability was in the script. Willis completely improvised the psychological breakdown, because he was desperate to prove to the world that he was a serious, dramatic actor. He wanted to show that John McClane was not an invincible superhero, but an exhausted, terrified husband who just wanted to go home. It changed the entire emotional core of the movie, making the audience care deeply about a guy who was basically destroying a corporate plaza. And while the hero was unexpectedly crying in the bathroom, the villain was dealing with his own embarrassing problem on the main floor. Number 10, flinching the villain. When you think of Hans Gruber, you think of a cold, calculating, incredibly sophisticated criminal mastermind. Alan Rickman played the role with a chilling, Shakespearean elegance that completely redefined what a Hollywood bad guy could be. But there was one massive, hilarious problem behind the scenes that constantly ruined his terrifying aura. Alan Rickman absolutely hated the loud, deafening noise of gunfire. He was a classically trained British theater actor, not a seasoned combat veteran. Every single time he had to fire his weapon on set, Rickman would instinctively screw his eyes tightly shut in absolute terror. It is an involuntary human reaction, but it looks completely ridiculous when you were supposed to be a ruthless international terrorist. John McTiernan was incredibly frustrated in the editing room because his brilliant villain kept aggressively blinking and wincing like a frightened child. If you watch the movie closely during any major shootout, the director had to constantly cut away from Rickman's face the exact millisecond before he pulls the trigger. They basically had to edit around the fact that the most dangerous man in the building was terrified of his own prop gun, which is a polite way of saying everyone on set probably needed a nap. However, that theater background ended up accidentally creating one of the best scenes in the entire film. Number 9. The fake accent that changed the movie. There is a legendary, unbearably tense sequence where John McClane finally bumps into Hans Gruber on the roof. But he does not know what the villain looks like. Gruber instantly drops his sophisticated European demeanor and perfectly mimics a terrified, nasal American hostage named Bill Clay. Fans often assume this brilliant game of cat and mouse was meticulously planned from the very beginning. The truth was much stranger and infinitely more spontaneous. That entire sequence was hastily scribbled on a piece of paper right in the middle of shooting. The writers were desperately trying to figure out a way for the two main characters to physically interact before the climax. During a break on the dusty set, McTiernan overheard Alan Rickman joking around with the crew, performing a flawless, exaggerated American accent just for fun. The director immediately grabbed the panicked writers and demanded they write a scene utilizing that exact voice. They literally handed the actors the freshly typed pages and shot the legendary confrontation right then and there. But this rushed, chaotic style of shooting action scenes was about to have a devastating, permanent consequence for the leading man. Number 8. The price of action. To make the gunfights look as chaotic and visceral as possible, McTiernan ordered the props department to use extra loud blank cartridges. He wanted massive, blinding muzzle flashes and a concussive sound that would physically shake the cameras. During the famous sequence where McClane shoots a terrorist from underneath a heavy wooden conference table, Willis was trapped in a very tight, enclosed space. He raised his prop gun directly next to his own head and fired multiple deafening rounds into the bottom of the table. The concussive shockwave of the extra loud blanks was trapped underneath the wood, bouncing directly back into Willis's left ear. The sheer physical force of the noise instantly ruptured his eardrum. Bruce Willis suffered a permanent, 2/3 hearing loss in his left ear that he carried for the rest of his life. It was a brutal, irreversible physical scar from a production that was constantly prioritizing cinematic spectacle over basic human safety. Hey, quick pause before we reach the absolute peak of this behind-the-scenes disaster. I have to ask you the most controversial question in pop culture history. Do you consider Die Hard a traditional summer action blockbuster, or is it mandatory viewing as a Christmas movie in your house? Let me know your definitive answer down in the comments below. And while you are scrolling down there, make sure you hit that like button and subscribe to Reel Behind so we can keep rewinding the memories together. All right, let us get back to the chaos because the production was about to accidentally terrorize the entire neighborhood. Number 7. Burning the bosses. If causing permanent hearing damage to your star was not enough, the special effects team decided to go completely unhinged for the grand finale. The script called for a massive police helicopter to explode violently on the roof of the Nakatomi building. Remember, they were shooting this on top of the actual 20th Century Fox corporate headquarters in the middle of Los Angeles. The pyrotechnics team severely miscalculated the sheer volume of explosive material needed for the shot. When they finally detonated the charge, it created a blinding, monstrous fireball that was significantly larger and much hotter than anyone anticipated. The explosion was so incredibly massive that the concussive shockwave actually blew out several real glass windows on the floors directly below the roof. The terrifying part? Those lower floors were completely occupied by actual 20th Century Fox executives and corporate lawyers, who were working late into the night. Imagine sitting at your desk, looking at a spreadsheet, and suddenly the ceiling shakes violently, the windows shatter inward, and a massive wall of orange flame illuminates the sky. The studio bosses literally thought their own building was under a genuine terrorist attack. In Hollywood, simple solution often means make it dramatically more complicated. But this time, they almost burned down their own paychecks. But this explosive disaster was absolutely nothing compared to the quiet, humiliating legal nightmare happening behind closed doors. Number 6. The unwanted hero. Today, it is completely impossible to separate Bruce Willis from his bloody, battered undershirt. He is the definitive, undisputed face of the modern action thriller. But when the script for Die Hard was aggressively circulating around Hollywood, literally nobody wanted to touch it. The studio executives originally offered the leading role to the biggest, most bankable action stars on the planet. Sylvester Stallone read the script and completely passed on it. Arnold Schwarzenegger, Burt Reynolds, Richard Gere, and even Harrison Ford took one look at the project and said, absolutely not. They all thought the idea of a vulnerable cop trapped in a single building was a terrible, career-ruining concept. They were used to playing indestructible demigods, not sweaty, relatable humans who actually bleed. 20th Century Fox was in an absolute state of panic, bleeding money on a massive script that every single A-list star had publicly rejected. They were scraping the absolute bottom of the Hollywood barrel, looking for anyone desperate enough to take the job. But ironically, the man who ultimately saved the franchise was not even the second or third choice on the list, because technically, a completely different Hollywood legend had been quietly holding the movie hostage for years. Number 5. Eastwood's secret ownership. Most fans have absolutely no idea that Die Hard is actually an adaptation of a dark, gritty novel called Nothing Lasts Forever, written by Roderick Thorpe. Back in the early 1980s, long before Fox even thought about building Nakatomi Plaza, the legendary Clint Eastwood acquired the exclusive film rights to the book. Eastwood actually planned to star in the movie himself, bringing his iconic tough guy persona to the claustrophobic skyscraper setting. For years, the project was completely stalled in development hell because Eastwood controlled the rights but kept delaying the production. The entire movie was essentially locked in a Hollywood vault, waiting for an aging cowboy to finally make up his mind. Eventually, Eastwood quietly let his exclusive contract expire, allowing 20th Century Fox to desperately swoop in and buy the rights. If Clint Eastwood had actually made the movie, we would have gotten a completely humorless, silent executioner instead of the sarcastic, fast-talking John McClane we know and love. But 20th Century Fox did not have a stoic cowboy. They had a sitcom star, and the entire entertainment industry thought it was a pathetic joke. Number 4. A laughingstock in Hollywood. When the studio finally ran out of traditional action stars, they offered the role to Bruce Willis, who was mostly known for starring in the romantic comedy television show Moonlighting. To secure him, Fox paid an unprecedented, absolutely mind-boggling salary of $5 million. In 1988, paying $5 million to a television comedian to lead a massive summer action blockbuster was considered financial suicide. The Hollywood press aggressively mocked the decision, publishing articles calling the movie a guaranteed catastrophic box office bomb. Industry insiders were openly laughing at the studio executives behind their backs, predicting that audiences would never accept the funny guy from television as a serious, gun-toting badass. The negative publicity was so incredibly intense that the studio bosses actually started to believe the critics. They realized they had spent millions of dollars on a leading man that nobody wanted to see in an action movie. So, they made a marketing decision that was purely driven by absolute, humiliating panic. Number 3. The faceless poster. Imagine spending $5 million to hire a lead actor and then being so terrified of his reputation that you actively hide him from the public. When the very first theatrical posters for Die Hard were shipped to movie theaters across the country, Bruce Willis was nowhere to be found. The studio marketing department designed a massive, dramatic poster that only showed the Nakatomi Plaza building exploding into flames. There was no face, no heroic pose, and absolutely no indication that Bruce Willis was even in the movie. The studio executives literally ordered the marketing team to hide their $5 million star, because they genuinely believed his face would prevent people from buying tickets. It was only after the movie actually opened and became a massive, undeniable word-of-mouth sensation that Fox frantically printed brand new posters. They desperately slapped Bruce Willis's smiling, battered face on the marketing materials, pretending they had believed in him the entire time. Because nothing says unwavering studio support like entirely erasing your lead actor until you know for sure the movie is profitable. But if you think Fox treating Bruce Willis badly was the wildest part of the casting process, you are not ready for the legal reality of this production. Because 20th Century Fox was legally obligated to offer the role to a senior citizen first. Number 2. The 73-year-old John McClane. Remember when I mentioned that Die Hard was based on a book called Nothing Lasts Forever? Well, that book was actually a direct sequel to a 1966 novel called The Detective. And in 1968, Hollywood adapted The Detective into a hit movie starring the legendary crooner himself, Frank Sinatra. Because of incredibly strict, unbreakable Hollywood contract laws regarding franchise sequels, 20th Century Fox had absolutely no choice. Before they could offer the role of the skyscraper-climbing, machine-gun-firing hero to anyone else, they were legally required to offer it to Frank Sinatra. In 1988, Frank Sinatra was 73 years old, suffering from declining health, and definitely not in the physical condition to crawl barefoot over shattered glass. The entire studio held its breath, absolutely terrified that the aging singer might actually say yes out of pure spite or contractual obligation. Thankfully, Sinatra formally declined the offer, officially releasing the studio from the legal nightmare and allowing them to completely rewrite the character into the John McClane we know today. Bruce Willis literally owes his entire action movie career to a 73-year-old jazz singer deciding he was too tired to fight German terrorists. But finally, we have reached the top floor of Nakatomi Plaza. We have talked about the exploding helicopters, the bleeding ears, and the legal chaos. But the most iconic, unforgettable moment in the entire movie was built on a foundation of pure, unadulterated betrayal. Number 1. The ultimate betrayal. The climax of Die Hard features Hans Gruber dramatically falling from the shattered window of the skyscraper, plunging to his spectacular death. Director John McTiernan wanted the scene to look as visceral and realistic as humanly possible. He brought Alan Rickman to the very edge of a terrifying, 40-foot-high platform suspended over a massive blue screen. Rickman was already incredibly nervous, tightly clutching the stuntman, holding him over the artificial abyss. McTiernan looked Rickman directly in the eyes and promised him that the stunt crew would drop him on the count of 3. But McTiernan had secretly pulled the stunt coordinator aside earlier and given him a completely different, ruthless instruction. He told the crew to drop the actor on the count of 1. So, the director shouted 1, and instantly the crew released the mechanism. Alan Rickman plummeted 40 feet backward into the darkness with absolutely no physical or mental preparation. The look of complete primal shock, widening eyes, and genuine terror you see on Hans Gruber's face as he falls in slow motion is not a brilliant piece of Shakespearean acting. It is the authentic, unfiltered panic of a man who just realized his director lied to him and threw him off a building. Rickman was reportedly furious when he landed safely on the airbag below, but McTiernan got exactly what he wanted. A reaction so perfectly, terrifyingly real that it cemented Hans Gruber as the greatest villain in action movie history. In the end, Die Hard was never supposed to be a masterpiece. It was a frantic, terrifying, beautifully chaotic disaster of a production. It was built on deafening mistakes, rejected scripts, fake rubber feet, and directors completely betraying their actors. But somehow, all of that behind-the-scenes insanity forged a movie that changed pop culture forever. It proved that sometimes the best art comes from the absolute worst planning. Until next time, keep rewinding the memories with Reel Behind.